Hello, my friends. Welcome. My name is Joe. This is the Joe Martino Show. And today we're going to talk about insight and behavior. Which one should we actually be chasing? Because in America, we chase insight, and maybe we shouldn't. Let's kick it off. This is the Joe Martino Show.
You're listening to the Joe Martino Show, a podcast dealing with all things emotional, relational, and human nature. Joe is a licensed counselor in the state of Michigan, specializing in relationship therapy. He is also the author of the book, The Emotionally Secure Couple. All advice offered in this episode is offered for entertainment and educational purposes only. Enjoy the show.
All right. Hello. Welcome to the Joe Martino Show. If this is your first time here, we welcome you. If this is not your first time, welcome back. I do know that I have quite a few long-term listeners, and I appreciate that. If you're brand new, I also appreciate that. Some of you have been emailing me, and I appreciate that. You've been sending me nice emails because I read a few of the not nice emails about a week ago or 2 weeks ago now. I don't know. And so you have been sending me nice emails, and I do appreciate that. To be fair, some of those were coming in before that, and that's good. And I appreciate that. I find the ones that are just very angry, usually I find them to be funny. And I'm not sure, we could probably root into what is the insight for that. Perhaps it is my childhood. Perhaps it is my early adulthood. Who knows? But I do find those funny. And that was a setup for what I want to talk about today. I want to talk to you today about what does it mean when we find insight, because one of the things that I am finding more interesting and more interesting as I become an old man in this field of counseling is that we chase insight often to the exclusion of anything beyond that, and people don't get better. I have said this in multiple episodes. I have said it to any of my friends that will listen. People are about to start coming for therapy because we have more money, more effort, more resources devoted to it. And by and large, we don't have greater outcomes. To be clear, I am not saying that I don't think therapy works. I do believe it works. I think it is important. I think that most people should probably engage it at some point in their lives and they will benefit from it. But the reality is we also have a lot of things going on in therapy that aren't helping people. And one of those is this obsession that we have with the idea of insight trumps. And so what happens is people go to therapy and they're like, hey, I treat my wife like a jerk. And guys, just so we're clear on this is an ADHD rant. I'm recording this in the morning. I've only literally had 2 sips of coffee. So you're going to get a little bit more of my ADHD. But guys, when I talk to guys and I'm like, hey, your wife gets to have emotions. Well, I don't care. Like we can't have a free-for-all. That is not a great statement. We can't have a free-for-all. Well, of course we can't have a free-for-all, but your wife gets to have her emotions. And if you're her husband, it is literally your responsibility to engage those feelings. Literally, it's your responsibility. I almost said it's your job, but that sounds bad to say something's your job if we're talking about a romantic relationship. Maybe once I have a cup of coffee, I'll change my opinion on that. Maybe this will get cut out in the editing, but I doubt it. Now, you might be wondering, what in the world does this have to do with insight versus behavior? Well, because here's what happens. In a lot of couples counseling that I do, I'll sit with people and they're just not behaving well, right? Like I literally sat with a couple one time and the husband, and he admitted this, he literally, this is not a figure of speech. He literally broke things around the house. He literally did things where 3 of his children ended up cowering in the corner and crying. And so he's sitting on my couch and he's like, I'm just wondering if it's because when I was in 8th grade, I got cut from the baseball team. You know what, bro? Maybe it is. But can I tell you something else? I really don't care. Now, I know this is heresy. In modern counseling, this is heresy. And there are going to be people who are no longer going to want to work for my agency if they hear this. There are going to be people who want to, string me up to the proverbial counseling cross. But I don't care why you're doing something that you completely control and you admit is wrong. You can stop that behavior without insight. Now, that doesn't mean you should stop looking for insight. If you want to continue to pursue insight and you want to continue to look for insight as to what created that behavior, then so be it. but you don't need insight to stop being a jerk. It doesn't matter if you got cut from the 8th grade baseball team. You don't have to be a jerk as an adult. I think this is really important. We need to ask ourselves, what behaviors are we engaging in that don't serve us? What behaviors are we engaging in that create distress for us? What behaviors are we engaging in that hurt people around us? What behaviors are we engaging in that we just know aren't healthy or aren't helpful to other people? We have this false belief that if I can understand what caused it, it'll be easier to stop it. That's not true. Now, there are sometimes we probably need to understand the insight. Maybe. I don't know. I've got to be honest with you. There's whole schools of therapy, and they're not new. So before you write me, I talked about this one time at a conference, not a conference, but an event. And somebody wrote me in there like, I just can't believe you're espousing these new theories. Alfred Adler isn't new, and he's probably one of the earliest ones to veer away from Jung and Freud. And he basically said that the past is worthless if we just live there. In fact, there are adherents of Adlerianism that would say there is no trauma. You don't have to understand your childhood trauma to be a better adult. And I know, like, this is heresy, and this is so against everything that we talk about today. But my point is, it's not a new theory. It's not a new theory. It's not a new idea. It is not a new concept. Alfred Adler's like right there in the founding fathers of therapy. And essentially these theories that move away from insight matters most, essentially what they talk about is the only thing that matters is the present. The past is only valuable to the extent that you utilize it to engage in good behaviors in the present. And this is where this beef that I have with how we're doing therapy in the modern day is we've created a lot of weird things, right? Like, well, my inner child is still alive in me. And that's why I was a jerk to my wife, because the little boy that lives inside of me from when I was 12. Dude, you're not 12 anymore. You're 52. Yeah, but my little boy. No, I don't care. And right now, if you haven't heard, there's a great brand new term, somatic therapy. It's coming for you. It's a little bit like when I was a kid and I was going to take a abnormal psychology class, and I realized I was like, oh, abnormal psychology is just psychology. I'll let you look up somatic therapy and see if it's any different from regular therapy. How's that sound? And there's going to be people like, it is different. Maybe. And like, look, I'm not trying to pick a fight today. I'm not. But I do want you to consider maybe our obsession with figuring out what happened when you were 12 and 6 and 20 and 25. Like, I was just listening to a book on attachment theory. And the woman's talking about how, she had this suppressed memory from when she was 3 about how her dog died. And that's why she was mean to her husband. No, you were mean to your husband because you just picked bad behaviors. Yeah, but Joe, if she can understand what created her desire for those bad behaviors, she still has to choose to not engage them. And that is the crux of healthy therapy. Healthy therapy helps you figure out the behaviors that you have to choose to have the life that you want, even if that behavior is just acceptance of what happened to you. I'm not trying to throw everything out here. I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't look into our past. It's helpful to look into our past to see where we've come from. But if looking into our past, we just hang out there, we just stop there, that doesn't work. If we don't move it forward to these are the behaviors that I have to engage in order to be healthy, that doesn't work. And if that's true, and I believe that it is, then I don't need insight beyond are the behaviors that I'm engaging in helpful or healthy to change my behaviors. And if I want to change my life, I have to change my behaviors, because behaviors bring change. If you've read my book, in the very beginning of the book, I talk about the 4 boxes: belief system, values, actions, consequences. Actions are the pivot point for change. But you have to go up into the belief system to ask yourself, what belief is driving this behavior? Maybe it's a disconnect between what I believe in my behavior, and that's creating the problem. But there's something going on there, and you have to go up into that. And in our modern day, we have the belief that insight creates change. It doesn't. Behavior does. And when we start to change our behaviors, that becomes very hard, because then what happens is we move to our responsibility. Yeah, but I'm a victim. And that's the rub. As long as we can chase insights, we can find somebody else to blame for the behaviors that we engage in as adults that aren't helpful. And I see this from 20-year-old girls to 58-year-old men, all across the spectrum. I see it from conservatives and liberals. It's all across the spectrum. I can do this because here's the insight. This is what happened. And then we get triggers and trauma responses and blah, 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 blah. So sure, those are real. We have triggers, but we could spell triggers Habits. We have trauma responses, but we could spell them Habits. For those of you who are spelling challenged, that's habits. And so I think a better way to go, rather than ask myself, why do I do this? What's in my childhood that drives this? I think a better way to go is to ask yourself first, is this behavior healthy? Well, Joe, I wouldn't be asking why I do it if I thought it was healthy. Maybe, maybe not. But if it isn't healthy, then I think the next question is, what can I do differently? And I see this a lot with Christian men. I try to keep my faith off of this podcast. I know that I have listeners who are not of faith, and I'm okay with that. I hope they're okay with that. I have my faith. They don't. I hope sometime that we can get a cup of coffee and I can talk to them about why I have faith. But I'm going to talk and pick on Christian men here for a minute. I see this the most with Christian men. They treat their wives poorly, and they either hide behind God in some sort of, well, I'm the head of the house, blah, 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 blah. Or they talk about something from their childhood. Well, I grew up in a hyper-conservative church. I grew up in a hyper-liberal church. My mom was mean. My daddy wasn't kind. No one cares why you're mean if you're being mean to them. Joe, but what about compassion? Yeah, we should have compassion. And for the dude that had a crazy mom that was mean to him, I'm really sorry about that. I can't relate to that. I didn't have that. For the dude that had an abusive father, I'm really sorry about that. But your wife doesn't care that that happened to you when you're being mean to her, when you are mistreating her, when you're being unkind to her. And you don't need to know that insight to be kind to her or to be nice to her or to treat her right or to love her the way you're supposed to. I know a guy whose daughter said to him, man, Dad, if somebody knew your story, they'd be surprised you're not an alcoholic. And not only was he not an alcoholic, but he was a good father and he is a good father and a good husband. He's still alive. I'm going to put this a different way. Your trauma, your trigger, your insight that you're chasing in your childhood is never an excuse for poor behavior to other people. And in truth, I would say it's never an excuse for poor behavior to you. If you're doing something that's hurting you, don't use your trauma as a kid to excuse it. If you know something is wrong and it's hurting your life, the whole, I was raised this way. Okay, awesome. Then start something new. Figure out what those behaviors are. Yeah, but Joe, that's really hard. Yes, I know. And that's almost a worthless statement too, because anything in life worth doing is hard. And what happens is we chase insight more than we're willing to chase behaviors. We're willing to fail at figuring out what caused my trauma response. What caused my trigger? What caused the little boy inside of me to do this? What caused my somatic run to do that? And we're willing to fail at that. We're not willing to fail at, you know what? This is the behavior I'm going to engage in. And then when it doesn't work, well, that didn't work. Maybe you just didn't engage in it enough for it to work. Maybe you just didn't fail enough for it to work. Here's the built-in danger to seeking insight. It allows us in a society that is responsibility adverse, in a society that really thinks when I'm a victim, that gives me an excuse. It allows us the opportunity to push responsibility for our health, for our wellness, for our emotional well-being off on someone else. It allows us the opportunity to blame someone else for our poor behavior towards our spouse. It allows us the opportunity to blame someone else for our poor behaviors towards our children. And I'm not saying don't go all or nothing thinking on this. I'm not saying we should get rid of looking for insight. I'm saying we should put as much energy into looking for better behaviors as we do in chasing insight. We should look for what are the behaviors that I can try? What are the small changes I can make? What that one guy calls atomic habits. I can never remember his name. But what are the small changes I can make that can push me forward to health, that can push me forward to wellness? That's where power of therapy is. That's why there's some therapists that they just don't ever help people, because they just sit there and reaffirm them and give them worksheets that don't get done until the morning of the next session. And it's all about their child and this and that and their inner child and their parents and their history high school teacher and blah, 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 blah. And it's not that that isn't important. Those things are important. I worked with a woman one time who was raped in a very specific type of vehicle. She was snatched off a sidewalk, pulled into a garage, and raped on a very specific type of vehicle. We had to spend a lot of time in her past events to help her get healthy. But ultimately, that came down to new behavior patterns for her. And here's what I'm suggesting. Instead of asking what is it that causes this bad behavior, we should start with the question, what new behavior could I try if I don't know this, what caused this? And we could even go a step further. We could ask ourselves, do I need to know what caused this? Will that in some way enhance my recovery? And I'm a little concerned with that question, because we're so conditioned that we have to know what happened in our childhood that that I think the answer is going to be yes, and we won't really have some sort of criteria to look at that. Because here's the thing, does engaging in this deep look into your childhood by itself change anything? No, because even if it's something, for instance, the woman who had the event on the bus, and I only use that word because I don't know if people are listening to this with their kids, and I don't want to lose my family-friendly rating in the podcast stores. If that woman, she had to come to the place where she accepted that that happened. But acceptance is a behavior. Acceptance is an action. It's a state of being, there is no doubt. But it is a bunch, a ton, a lot repetitive actions over and over and over again, which is what repetitive means. Healing required her to engage in behaviors that her brain told her not to. Healing required her to engage in the behavior of acceptance. That happened to her. That event happened to her. And I use that word because I don't want to lose my family-friendly rating in the podcast store. She went through that assault, and she has to accept that. And she probably has to do it multiple times a day in certain environments. And her brain's going to scream at her. And she can look at the trauma, and she can look at the trigger, and she can know that it's real. But it does lead to a next question. When you feel that trauma rise up, that trauma response, when you feel that trigger kick in, can you use it to change your behavior? Because I believe you can. I believe you can change your trigger, what it releases, if you can do the work. And that's where it's really hard. And that's where it says it doesn't matter what happened to me. I have to heal. I have to be responsible for my healing. And healing requires new behaviors. I was telling someone recently, in fact, I tell my clients this a lot. There are times that I get really angry with my wife, like see red, not times, once in a while. And there are probably times when she gets really angry with me. That's probably a bit higher than the times I get mad at her. I just go along to get along. That's funny. And what I said, there though. But what's funny is I can use that as a trigger to just keep my mouth shut. Just put my top jaw to my bottom jaw. And you can too. You can learn, you can condition yourself so that your trigger triggers healthy behaviors. All right, I hope that this has been a helpful episode for you. I want you to consider the idea that for most of our behaviors, for most of the things that we need to heal from, insight is helpful, or actually, let me rephrase that. Insight might be helpful, but it is not required. It is not required for change. If you know you're being unkind, you don't need insight to change to be kind. If you know that you are engaging in addictive behaviors, you don't need insight to get help for those addictive behaviors and to change them. And I know that's incredibly controversial. I know that our addictions therapy field is really some of the places where this insight idea has been formulated and really propagated. But we have got to realize that insight's only helpful if it allows us to move to behaviors. Insight that keeps us stuck in the past is not helpful. Insight that allows us to live in victimhood, not helpful. Insight that gives us a reason to engage in poor behaviors, not helpful. Recognition of poor behaviors, recognition of mental unwellness, recognition of emotional unwellness is all that is required for a change in behaviors. And a change in behaviors is always required for a healthier place, even if that change of behavior is acceptance, because that is a behavior. All right, thanks so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed this show. If you did, please feel free to share it with your friends. We'll catch you next week.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share with a friend. And hey, give us that rating in your podcast store. Until next time, change possible.